He was the future. I mean, political figures who want to be president, their egos are off the chart. I mean, megalomaniacs, easy. And that's Democrats and Republicans.
Sure.
So Lindsey's stirring, without really intending to, he's trying to get votes. He's a politician. But he's stirring the first. There were hard hats in the financial district watching from high on the steel. And a lot of them never had a chance to go to college. They couldn't. A lot of them were Vietnam veterans. And at first they were with the protesters because the protesters, the hard hats, believed were part of the same Democratic Party constituency.
Yeah.
As far as the hard hats were concerned, and I found sympathy and related to the hard hats even then, even though I was kind of power to the people type of guy in my youth. But because of class, I always found, and still do, side with working people. The hard hats began to think, as I concluded with the election of Bill Clinton, that the university students and the middle class, the mobile, upwardly mobile middle class, are our enemies. And since the election of Clinton, I've been convinced that the upper middle class liberals are our enemy. That's just my deal. But I want to go back to the riots. But that's how the hard hats began to see things.
Okay.
And on several occasions, as the students were demonstrating, and they were raucous, the hard hats charged into them with wrenches and hammers.
Wow.
And there was pitched battles in the street. It was ugly. But that was the moment, according to the author, and according to no less of a figure than James Carville, who was Bill Clinton's chief strategist, that was the moment. That was the symbolic moment when the Democratic Party lost the white working class. And they've been kind of paying the price ever since. That's why they're so desperate to hang on to the black vote. And the black vote, by the way, is kind of some of the black activists, and I would congratulate them on their courage. They have been saying we've been backing the Democratic Party for years, and all we get is a lot of talk. Kind of like John Lindsay, or kind of like Bill Clinton, or even Barack Obama, and the man was black.
Mm-hmm.
So what has happened is more of a cultural and class conflict than people like to admit. Because nobody in the United States likes to admit there's such a thing as class or class prejudice. But it's very, very much alive.
Even though we say, when we think of sort of our corporate founding, that everyone is given these inalienable rights, and that everyone is created equal, but I think there is a sort of classism that goes against that.
Right. But there's only one Christianity. There should be only one Christianity. Some suspect, the Presbyterian Church is a business church.
Well, yeah, and there's actually something like thousands of different Christian denominations since the Protestant Reformation. So even though there's one church, global church that is, there's literally thousands of different kinds of churches where, someone distinguishes themselves from some other kind of church.
One of your predecessors, Pope David Feltman I, when he was here, he fought against that passionately. He was aware that some of his parishioners thought, well, we're an upper middle class church. We're the church where smart Protestants and successful people go in Fort Dunn.
Mm-hmm.
And David didn't want to lose them, of course. They bring a lot of money to the church, and you can't do much without money. But he wanted very much to make the Presbyterian Church a welcoming church.
Yeah.
That's when I went to the Presbyterian Church, and I was surprised at the way people were treated. I came from the Catholic Church, of course. And I have to admit the Catholic Church still influences me, but what I realized is there was much more a sense of equality in the Presbyterian Church than there was in the Catholic Church at the time.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, the priesthood still inserts itself between the people and God, and they can't let go of that for obvious reasons. But that's not my deal, I like more of a personal relationship with God. But here I am talking about myself again. It's a fault. I'm sorry. But so as we look at this conflict now in Portland, and I read reports that most of these demonstrations in our major cities are led by a very specific demographic group. White women in their 30s and 40s with a college degree.
Interesting.
And if you see the violent protests, you don't see very many black people.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen violent video after violent video from Portland, Seattle. I don't see any black people. I see white people who are enraged about, I don't even think they know what. But they're showing up. They're showing up now in peaceful protesters because the people that John Lindsay was afraid of are who the Democratic are who Nancy Pelosi and her people are afraid of today. They don't want to lose those people in the street because they're the energy, they're the passion, they believe. These are the people that are going to drive the election.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they could drive it into the ground, obviously.
Well,
I'm going to finish up my point here. I'm going to let you respond. Are these things that we're seeing, and you've alluded to it, are they acts of war, of a civil war of type? Have they moved beyond peaceful protest? And if they have, you don't have to agree with my underlying premise, but if they have, what do we do with these peaceful protesters?
Yeah, well, there's a lot in there, and
yeah, there's a lot in there. I talked for about 9 minutes.
Yeah, I'll give you my answer on the other side of the break.
No, you have plenty of time this side.
There's a lot in there because I think there's a lot that's going on right now, and there's a lot to unpack that we all are going through. I think, quite honestly, there's also just been this conglomeration, this mixture with how everyone was feeling in response to the coronavirus and being cooped up at home with nothing else to do.
A lot of pressure.
And all of that comes to a boiling point. I mean, people losing jobs, economic uncertainty, and then, as you and I were talking earlier, even just with healthcare and insurance and things like that, as people are losing their jobs, they're losing their insurance, they're losing their benefits. So all of that stuff is up in the air right now. I think something that's very different than even the times that you were describing now almost 50 years ago is with the internet, we have 24-hour news.
Yes.
So any outbreak, anything that's going on, we hear about it immediately. Through social media, all of that gets exacerbated. And so anyone now can feel like anywhere they can become an activist, even if they don't live in that same community. And so then people travel, they hear that this stuff is going on over in Portland. So then they'll travel from all sorts of different places. So what's different, say, about this time is, say, to where our country was in the 19th century leading up to the 1860s, was then a lot of these divisions and these prevailing ideals were geographically based, with the North and the South. And sure, the North and the South were not completely monolithic, that you had some people that didn't agree on either side about what was happening, but by and large, there were geographic influences for those ways of thought. I think what's also complicating what's going on right now is that this feeling of almost a civil war, it's happening all over the country. There's no geographic divide. There might be a divide between cities and rural, suburban, and
there is, definitely.
Places. But, there's no, it's not like it's just in one coast or anything like that. So these issues pop up all over the place. And every one of us, you and I here in Fort Dodge, Iowa, we are having an opinion. We're being confronted with what's going on in some of these other places in ways that I think just it contributes to all of us feeling like we have to pick a side. So I do think, at the very least, intellectually, it feels like there's a war going on. And then I would say for people in Portland in the streets, it's not just intellectual, it's physical.
It's visceral.
Yeah. And, there are people...
But is there any real substance
to what people are fighting about?
Right. I mean, it seems like they're fighting to be fighting. They're fighting because they just don't like our country.
Well, so maybe that's the substance of what people are fighting about. What's the narrative we tell about our country? I think this is being...
Land of the free and home of the brave, homie.
Well, yeah, and, we take the statues in that issue, and there's this sense that anyone who's ever done anything wrong at all in their lives should not be commemorated, right?
Yeah.
And so we look at the legacy of some of our founding fathers, and we say, well, we can't have statues of them because they owned slaves. And to be clear, owning a slave is a horrible thing, obviously. But we as a country have progressed, and
we've evolved.
Yeah.
I mean, to take that to its national progression, Washington, D.C. would have to be renamed.
Exactly.
George Washington was a slaveholder.
Yeah.
And today, when Congressman John Lewis and his hearse was driven around Washington, D.C., they stopped by the Martin Luther King exhibit, the Black Lives Matter sign in Washington, D.C., but they conspicuously did not pass by President
was it Jefferson?
Thomas Jefferson. They passed him by. Jefferson was the author of the Constitution.
Well, and I'm going to sound horrible saying this, but I'll say it anyway. So if we only were to judge these past people by current standards, we couldn't even be venerating Martin Luther King, because some of the ways that he treated women would certainly not hold up to the Me Too movement standards that we have of ourselves today. And, if we are canceling anyone...
Another thing they don't want to talk about. Martin Luther King was a handsome man, and he was very charismatic.
Now,
he had a hell of an effect on women.
Yeah.
You don't hear that from the Me Too's, do you?
Well, but so does that mean that everything that Dr. Martin Luther King stood for has no value, or that we should forget it? Absolutely not. He definitely should be venerated and celebrated, all these other things, even though he wasn't perfect. And I think, why can't we hold on to those two things that are both true with all of these people who came before us?
There is a duality in every human being. There is, and Martin Luther King, Dr. King at the time, well, you'd have to ask Mrs. King how she felt, but I don't know if he felt he was doing anything wrong at the time, as long as he wasn't harming his wife. As I recall, men of his generation thought that way. Well, I'm just exercising and,
Well, exactly. And the same could be said about those early founding fathers who were slave owners. Maybe some of them didn't think they were doing anything wrong because that was their time.
They did not. But apparently you and I, by our Caucasian bloodline, are responsible for that.
Well.
And as I've said many times, Pastor Hill, I've never owned a slave. The very idea is abhorrent to me. I'm not some babbling white liberal out there angrily denouncing everybody. I think that's phony. I do. I think
there is a lot of that virtue signaling going on right now, too.
God, please. And I mean, it all gets tied up in the masking that we're asked to do for COVID-19.
I mean, all of it.
All of it. It sounds... Here, I have the answer. People, why won't you just mask up? I have the answer. Because you keep telling us what to do. You people, the same damn people who are out there demonstrating in the streets in New York in 1970 in your cashmere sweaters and suede jackets that cost your dad $500 are still talking down your nose to us. And by the way, the one thing that was missed about all of this is that the protesters were right in the first place. And Lindsay and the Democrats completely missed it. Global capitalism was the problem, was the real thing to be protested about. But you know who the global capitalists are? They're the contributors to the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. They own them both!
Exactly. It's on both sides.
Anyway, Pastor Austin Hill is here, and we're going to come back.
Michael Devine at AM 1400.
In the name of justice and the American way of life.
With 60 rounds of freedom.
Your news, your town, your station. KVFD News when it breaks.
From the Jerry Sheeter Newsroom, I'm Rob Jones. The victim of the deadly weekend apartment fire here in Fort Dodge has been identified. 67-year-old Gene Miller was pronounced dead at the scene after being found unresponsive in the apartment. Fort Dodge Fire Rescue